Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the piercing howl of a hound echoing through the mist-shrouded forests of 13th century England, where the bond between human and dog meant the difference between survival and starvation, between safety and becoming prey yourself, in a world where wolves still roamed freely, and bandits lurked behind every bend in the muddy road. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, you're William the Miller, and it's just before dawn in the year 1247. Your dog, a shaggy creature you call Brasha, is pressed against your legs under the rough wool blanket you share. The straw beneath you crackles as you shift, and you can smell the sour-sweet scent of fermenting grain from your mill wheel, mixed with the earthy musk of your faithful companion. Brasha's ears twitch at sounds you can't even hear yet, the distant shuffle of something moving through the underbrush beyond your cottage walls. This isn't some romantic notion of medieval pet ownership we're talking about here. This is survival, pure and simple. Brache isn't just your companion, he's your early warning system, your hunting partner, your garbage disposal, and quite possibly the reason you'll live to see another winter. Because in medieval times, owning a dog wasn't a luxury or a cute lifestyle choice. It was as essential as owning a good knife or knowing which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. Let's start with the most basic question. What did these dogs actually look like? Forget everything you think you know about medieval dogs from movies and fantasy shows. These weren't noble, perfectly groomed creatures prancing around castle courtyards. Most dogs were mutts, tough, scrappy survivors bred for function over form. They were smaller than you might expect too. Food was scarce, and a dog that ate too much was a liability you couldn't afford. If you were a peasant like William, your dog probably looked something like a modern terrier or small hound, maybe 30 to 40 pounds, with a coat thick enough to handle sleeping outdoors, but not so fluffy that burrs and thorns would turn every walk into a grooming nightmare. These dogs had lean faces, alert eyes, and that particular look of intelligence that comes from having to think fast to survive. Their coats were usually brown, black, or grey, colours that helped them blend into the forest when they were hunting or hiding. But here's where it gets interesting. The type of dog you owned was actually a matter of law. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval England had strict regulations about who could own what kind of dog. If you were a commoner living near royal forests, which covered about a third of England, your dog had to be lord. This meant having 3 toes cut off the front paws, so the dog couldn't chase the king's deer effectively. Imagine trying to explain that to modern dog owners. Sorry Rex, but the law says I have to maim you so you can't hunt the king's animals. The process of lawing was as brutal as it sounds. Every 3 years, foresters would go from village to village with a special knife and a wooden block. Dogs over a certain size, they measured this by seeing if the dog could fit through a special metal loop, had to submit to this mutilation. The owner held the dog down, or the forester placed the paw on the block and brought the knife down, removing the toes in one swift cut. Many dogs died from infection afterward. Those that survived were left with a permanent limp and a constant reminder of their place in the social hierarchy. William's dog Brachette bears these scars. You can see him favour his left front paw on cold mornings, and sometimes he whimpers in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of the day the foresters came. But Brachette adapted, as dogs do. He learned to use his remaining toes more effectively, to rely more on his nose and ears than his speed. In many ways, this made him an even better companion for William. He couldn't chase deer, but he could still track rabbits, alert to strangers, and guard the mill at night. Now, let's talk about what these dogs actually ate. because this is where medieval dog ownership gets really gritty. There was no such thing as dog food. No convenient bags of kibble, no cans of meat and gravy. Your dog ate what you ate, if you were lucky enough to have extra. Most of the time that meant scraps, bread crusts so hard they could break teeth, bits of gristle too tough for human consumption, vegetable peelings, and whatever your dog could catch on his own. William feeds Brashay, a mixture of barley meal mixed with water, basically watery porridge, along with any bones left over from the rare occasions when meat graced their table. But Brashay is expected to supplement this meagre diet himself. He hunts mice in the mill, catches the occasional rat, and when he's really lucky, manages to snare a rabbit in the woods. William has trained him not to eat his catch immediately, but to bring it home to share. It's a delicate balance. Brashay needs to eat enough to stay strong and healthy, but not so much that he becomes lazy or selective about what he'll hunt. During the worst times, and there were many worse times in medieval life, William and Brashay would compete for the same food sources. Both of them would dig for root vegetables in the forest. Both would search for birds' eggs. Both would know which herbs and plants could fill an empty belly without causing sickness. There's a particular kind of intimacy that develops when you and your dog are both genuinely hungry, when you're both scavenging for survival. It strips away any pretense about the relationship. You're not a pet owner, you're partners in the business of staying alive. The smell of a medieval dog would have been intense. Brashay probably hadn't had a proper bath in months. His coat carried the scent of wood smoke from sleeping near the fire, the musky smell of the mill, where grain dust settled into his fur, and the earthy odour of a creature that spent most of its time outdoors, rolling in things that modern sensibilities would find revolting. Medieval people, of course, didn't smell much better themselves, so this probably didn't bother William much. In fact, Brashay's scent was probably comforting, familiar and reassuring in a world full of unfamiliar dangers. But let's talk about what these dogs were actually trained to do, because this is where medieval dog ownership becomes truly fascinating. Brashay wasn't just William's pet. He was a working professional with specific job responsibilities. His primary duty was guarding the mill at night. Thieves were a constant threat, and grain was valuable enough to steal. Brashay slept with one ear always open, ready to raise an alarm if anyone approached the mill after dark. But his job description went far beyond simple security work. Brashay was trained to herd the few chickens William owned, keeping them from wandering too far from the cottage and protecting them from foxes and hawks. He could track wounded animals through the forest, useful when William managed to wound a deer with his bow, but the animal fled before dying. He could find lost tools dropped in tall grass, locate missing chickens that had wandered off to lay eggs in hidden nests, and even help with the mill work itself by turning the smaller grinding wheels when the water level was too low to power the main wheel. Training a medieval dog was nothing like modern dog training. There were no treats, no positive reinforcement techniques, no clickers or reward systems. Training was harsh, immediate, and practical. When Brashay made a mistake, William would cuff him sharply or withhold food. When he performed well, his reward was simply being allowed to eat his portion and sleep by the fire. The relationship was built on mutual respect and necessity rather than affection, though affection certainly developed over time. William trained Brashay using a combination of hand signals and whistles that could be heard over long distances. In the forest, where speaking aloud might alert prey or predators to your presence, communication had to be silent and efficient. Brashay learned to respond to different whistle patterns. One long, two short meant come back immediately. 3 short blasts meant stay in guard. A continuous trill meant hunt. These signals were developed over years of working together, refined through trial and error, until they became a private language between man and dog. The bond between William and Brachet was forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence. On winter nights when the fire burned low and the wind howled through gaps in the cottage walls, they huddled together for warmth. Brachet's body heat was genuinely necessary for William's survival during the coldest months. In return, William shared his food, even when it meant going hungry himself, because he knew that a weak dog was a useless dog, and a useless dog was a dead dog. But this relationship existed within a brutal social context that modern dog lovers would find horrifying. Dogs in medieval times were viewed as property, not family members. If Brachet bit someone, even in defense of William or his property, he could be killed on the spot. If he killed someone's chicken, William would be required to pay compensation that might represent weeks of income. If Brachet became sick or injured and couldn't work, William would face a terrible choice: spend precious resources trying to heal him or put him out of his misery and find a replacement. There were no veterinarians, no animal hospitals, no understanding of animal medicine beyond the most basic folk remedies. When Brachet developed a limp, William treated it with the same herbs he would use for his own joint pain. When Brachet got worms, a constant problem with his diet of scraps and raw meat, William dosed him with bitter herbs and hoped for the best. Most injuries and illnesses were simply endured until they either healed naturally or killed the animal. The average lifespan of a working dog in medieval times was probably 5 to 7 years. Disease, injury, starvation, and simple exhaustion took their toll. William had owned 3 dogs before Brachet, and he would likely own 2 or 3 more after Brachet died. Each dog was mourned, but pragmatically replaced. Sentiment was a luxury that few could afford. Yet, despite the harsh realities, genuine affection did develop between medieval people and their dogs. William talks to Brachet constantly as they work together, a running commentary on the day's activities, the weather, their hopes for a good harvest. Brachet responds with tail wags, head tilts, and soft whines that William has learned to interpret. On quiet evenings, William might scratch behind Brachet's ears or let him rest his head on his lap while they sit by the fire. These moments of tenderness were stolen from a world that demanded constant vigilance and hard work. They were all the more precious for being rare. When Brachet brings William a dead rabbit, tail wagging with pride, William's praise is genuinely heartfelt. When William returns from a trip to the market town, and Brachet greets him with ecstatic joy, the miller's smile is real and warm despite his exhaustion. The relationship between human and dog in medieval times was complicated by the religious attitudes of the era. The Catholic Church taught that animals had no souls, that they were put on earth solely for human use. This theological position made it easier to justify the harsh treatment of animals, but it also created internal conflict for people who clearly loved their dogs. William sometimes wondered if his affection for Brachet was sinful, if caring too much for a soulless creature might distract him from his duties to God and his fellow humans. But practical necessity trumped theological concerns. Brachet wasn't just William's companion, he was part of an ecosystem of survival that included the miller's few chickens, his vegetable garden, his mill wheel, and his own hard-earned skills. Remove any element of this system, and the whole thing might collapse. William couldn't afford to think of Brachet as just property any more than he could afford to think of him as a pampered pet. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life shaped the relationship between William and Brachet in ways that modern pet ownership can't really capture. In spring, they worked together to plant the small garden behind the cottage, with Brachet helping to dig holes and chase away birds that tried to eat the seeds. In summer, they spent long days in the forest gathering berries, nuts and medicinal herbs, with Brachet serving as both pack animal and guard. In autumn, they worked frantically to prepare for winter, smoking meat, storing grain, gathering firewood, with Brace's help essential for tracking game and finding the best sources of winter fuel. And in winter, they simply survived together, conserving energy and sharing warmth until spring came again. Each season brought its own dangers and opportunities. Spring floods could wash away the mill wheel or contaminate the grain stores. Summer droughts could stop the mill entirely. Autumn brought the constant threat of raiders looking to steal the harvest. Winter meant wolves, hunger, and the ever-present possibility of freezing to death. Through all of this, Braque was William's constant companion, sharing every hardship and every small victory. The social aspects of dog ownership in medieval times were complex and revealing. William's status in the village was partially determined by Brace's abilities. A man with a good dog was considered more reliable, more capable, more worthy of respect. When the village faced a crisis, a missing child, a wolf pack threatening the livestock, a need to track down thieves, William and Brace were among the first called upon to help. Their reputation was built on their partnership, their ability to work together effectively under pressure. But this also meant that William was responsible for Brace's behaviour in ways that extended far beyond his own household. If Brace fought with another dog, William might find himself embroiled in a dispute with the other dog's owner. If Brace failed to perform when the village needed him, William's reputation would suffer. The dog's successes and failures reflected directly on the man, creating a pressure that modern pet owners rarely experience. William trained Brace not just for his own needs, but for the community's expectations. Brace had to be fierce enough to deter thieves and wolves, but gentle enough not to threaten children or elderly villagers. He had to be obedient enough to work effectively with William, but independent enough to make good decisions when working alone. He had to be healthy and strong enough to inspire confidence, but not so well fed that he appeared to be taking resources away from human mouths. The economics of dog ownership in medieval times were brutally simple. A dog had to earn his keep, or he became a liability. Brace's value was measured in concrete terms. How many rats did he catch in the mill? How often did his warnings prevent theft? How much food did he help procure through hunting? How much work did he save William by helping with daily tasks? If the answer to these questions didn't add up to more than the cost of feeding him, then keeping Brace was a luxury William couldn't afford. This economic pressure created a different kind of relationship than modern pet ownership. William genuinely loved Brace, but he also viewed him as a business partner. Brace's successes were celebrated not just because they made William happy, but because they improved both their chances of survival. Brace's failures were corrected not just to maintain discipline, but because mistakes could literally mean the difference between eating and starving. Yet within this harsh framework, moments of pure joy still occurred. When Brace successfully tracked a wounded deer through 2 miles of forest, when he alerted William to thieves trying to steal grain in the middle of the night, when he found a hen's nest full of eggs that had been laid in a hidden spot, these victories were celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. William would share extra food, scratch Brace's favourite spots, and tell anyone who would listen about his dog's intelligence and loyalty. The medieval world was full of superstitions about dogs, and these beliefs shaped how William thought about and treated Brace. Dogs were thought to be able to see spirits and demons invisible to human eyes. When Brace barked at empty air, or refused to enter certain parts of the forest, William took these warnings seriously. Dogs were also believed to be able to predict weather changes, illness, and death. William watched Brace's behaviour carefully for signs of coming storms, crop failures, or disease. Some of these superstitions were beneficial to the dogs themselves. A dog that saved his owner's life was sometimes believed to have special spiritual protection, making him more valuable and ensuring better treatment. A dog that consistently found game or warned of danger was sometimes thought to be blessed, earning him respect and care that went beyond mere economic utility. But other superstitions were dangerous. Dogs that howled at night were sometimes killed because people believed they were summoning evil spirits. Dogs with unusual markings or behaviors might be suspected of being witches' familiars. During times of plague or other disasters, dogs were sometimes killed because people believed they were spreading disease or bringing bad luck. William had to navigate these beliefs carefully. He was proud of Brachet's abilities, but he couldn't appear to boast too much about them or risk having his dog viewed with suspicion. He encouraged Brachet's natural instincts for tracking and hunting, but discouraged behaviors that might be interpreted as supernatural or threatening. The daily routine of life with a medieval dog was shaped by practical considerations that modern dog owners never face. Brachet woke before dawn, alerted by sounds and smells that told him the day was beginning. He would stretch, shake off the straw from his sleeping spot near the fire, and pad outside to relieve himself in the designated area behind the cottage, an area that William carefully maintained, because human and animal waste was valuable fertilizer for their small garden. While William built up the fire and prepared their simple breakfast, Brachet would make his morning rounds of the property. He checked the mill wheel for any damage from the night's work, investigated any new scents around the cottage, and made sure the chickens were all accounted for. This wasn't trained behavior. It was instinct, refined by experience, the natural response of a creature whose survival depended on maintaining awareness of his territory. After their meagre breakfast, usually barley porridge for William and whatever scraps were available for Brachet, they would begin the day's work. If grain needed to be ground, Brachet would help by turning the smaller wheels when the water pressure was insufficient for the main wheel. If hunting was necessary, they would head into the forest together, with Brachet's nose leading them to game trails and William's knowledge of the terrain keeping them both safe. The texture of daily life was rough, uncomfortable, and precarious in ways that would be almost unbearable to modern sensibilities. William's hands were permanently stained with grain dust and scarred from years of working with rough tools and machinery. Brachet's paws were tough as leather from walking on stones, thorns, and frozen ground. Both of them carried fleas and other parasites that were simply accepted as part of life. Both of them knew the gnawing discomfort of chronic hunger, the ache of joints stressed by constant physical labor, the anxiety of never being completely sure where the next meal would come from. But they also knew pleasures that modern life can't replicate. The satisfaction of successfully tracking prey through difficult terrain, the relief of a warm fire on a cold night, the simple joy of sharing food after a successful hunt. These pleasures were intensified by their rarity and their importance to survival. A modern dog owner might take their pet's companionship for granted, but William never forgot that Brachet's presence meant the difference between loneliness and companionship, between vulnerability and protection, between despair and hope. As night fell and William banked the fire for the night, Brachet would take up his position near the door, ears alert for any sound that might indicate danger. Even in sleep, he remained partially aware, ready to wake William at the first sign of trouble. This vigilance was exhausting, but it was also the price of survival in a world where danger was constant and help was rarely available. The bond between William and Brachet was forged in this crucible of mutual dependence and shared hardship. It was different from the affectionate relationships between modern pet owners and their animals, harder, more practical, more essential to survival. But it was also deeper in some ways, built on absolute trust and genuine need, rather than sentiment and convenience. When William reached out in the darkness to touch Brachet's warm fur, he wasn't just seeking comfort, he was confirming that his partner, his protector, his friend was still there, still breathing, still ready to face whatever challenges the next day might bring. The changing seasons brought different challenges and opportunities for William and Britch's partnership. Winter was perhaps the most brutal test of their relationship. When the mill wheel froze solid and no grain could be ground, William's income disappeared entirely. The cottage became a prison of sorts, with both man and dog confined to the single room, sharing body heat and rationing the meagre stores they had managed to accumulate during the harvest season. During these long winter months, Braquet's role shifted dramatically. No longer was he primarily a working dog. He became William's lifeline to sanity and survival. The isolation of medieval winter was crushing in ways that modern people, with their electric lights and constant entertainment, can barely comprehend. Weeks would pass without seeing another human face, without hearing another voice, except for the conversations William held with Braquet. The dog became William's confessor, his confidant, his only companion during the darkest months of the year. William would tell Braquet about his fears, that the grain stores wouldn't last until spring, that the roof might collapse under the weight of snow, that bandits might discover their hiding place and steal what little they had. Braquet would listen with those intelligent brown eyes, occasionally whining in response or nudging William's hand with his cold nose, providing comfort that was both physical and emotional. But winter also brought out the predator in both of them. When the stored grain ran low and the last of the preserved meat was consumed, William and Braquet would venture out into the frozen wasteland to hunt. These expeditions were desperate affairs, more about survival than sport. They would track rabbits through the snow, their breath visible in the frigid air, their hands and paws numb with cold. Braquet's ability to follow scent trails, even in freezing conditions, often meant the difference between eating and starving. The hunt itself was a grim ballet of survival. Braquet would flush the prey from its hiding place, while William waited with his crude bow, arrows fletched with feathers saved from their own chickens. The arrow had to count. They couldn't afford to waste the precious few they had. When Braquet brought down a rabbit with his teeth, the killing was quick and efficient, but William always felt the weight of taking life, even when that life meant his own survival. They would return to the cottage with their kill, and the butchering process was a shared ritual. William would skin and clean the animal, while Braquet waited patiently for his share. Nothing was wasted. The meat was divided carefully. The bones were cracked for marrow. The hide was cleaned and saved for patches or future use. Even the blood was collected and mixed with grain to make a nutritious porridge that would sustain them for another day or two. These hunting expeditions were also dangerous in ways that went beyond the simple challenge of finding prey. Wolves still roamed the forests around William's mill, and a hungry wolf pack could easily overcome a lone man and his dog. William had heard stories of travellers found in spring, their frozen bodies torn apart by wolf teeth, their dogs dead beside them in final acts of loyalty. Every time they ventured into the winter forest, both William and Braquet were acutely aware that they might not return. The wolf threat was real and constant during the winter months. William had reinforced the cottage door with iron bars salvaged from old mill equipment, and he kept a spear by the door at all times. Braquet's hackles would rise when he sensed wolves in the area, and his low growls would wake William from even the deepest sleep. On particularly bad nights, when the howling seemed to come from all directions, William would build up the fire until it roared, knowing that the light and smoke would keep the predators at bay. But the wolves weren't the only winter danger. Desperate humans could be just as deadly as wild animals. Starving peasants, driven from their homes by failed harvests or cruel lords, sometimes turned to banditry to survive. A lone miller, with stored grain and a warm cottage, was an attractive target for men who had nothing left to lose. Braquet's keen senses often detected these human predators before William's duller perception could identify the threat. There was one particular night in William's memory that stood out with crystal clarity. He had been awakened by Brackhead's urgent whining, a sound the dog made only when danger was imminent. Outside, the wind was howling through the bare branches, but underneath that natural sound, Brackhead detected something else: the soft crunch of footsteps in snow, the muffled whisper of voices trying to remain unheard. William had grabbed his spear and moved to the narrow window, peering out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then gradually shapes began to emerge from the tree line. 3 figures moving stealthily toward the cottage, their intent clearly malicious. They were thin, desperate-looking men, their clothes little more than rags, their faces gaunt with hunger. Brochet had remained silent as William prepared for the confrontation, but his entire body was tense with readiness. When William opened the door suddenly and stepped out with his spear raised, shouting a warning, Brochet exploded into action. The dog's fierce barking shattered the night silence, and his snarling charge sent the would-be bandits fleeing back into the forest. It was a calculated risk. The noise might attract more dangerous attention, but it worked. The men never returned. That incident had deepened the bond between William and Brochet even further. The dog had quite literally saved William's life, and possibly his own as well. The bandits would certainly have killed Brochet to prevent him from raising an alarm during their robbery. William had rewarded his faithful companion with extra food for a week, but more importantly, he had gained an even deeper appreciation for the intelligence and loyalty of his 4-legged partner. Spring brought its own challenges and revelations about the nature of their relationship. As the snow melted and the mill wheel began turning again, William and Bracker had to readjust to a world of abundance after months of scarcity. The psychological transition was almost as difficult as the physical one. After months of careful rationing and constant hunger, the idea of having enough food seemed almost impossible to believe. But spring also meant the return of other people to William's world. Farmers began bringing grain to be milled. Travellers started using the roads again, and the social aspects of dog ownership became relevant once more. William had to present himself and Berkshire as a competent, reliable team to maintain his reputation and ensure continued business. The contrast between winter isolation and spring social interaction highlighted just how much William had come to depend on Brochet for emotional support as well as practical assistance. During the long winter months, Brochet had been his only companion, his only source of warmth and comfort. Now suddenly, there were human voices in his cottage again, human hands to shake, human problems to solve. But William found that the months of intimate companionship with Brochet had changed him in subtle ways. He was more attuned to non-verbal communication, more patient with the process of building trust, more aware of the importance of loyalty and consistency in relationships. The lessons he had learned from living with a dog had made him a better human being, though he would never have phrased it that way. The spring mating season brought another dimension to Brocket's life that William had to navigate carefully. Brochet was an intact male, and his natural instincts to find female dogs in heat could conflict with his duties as William's working partner. The nearest female dogs were in the village, miles away, and allowing Brochet to pursue his romantic interests could mean losing him for days at a time. William had learned to recognize the signs when Brochet was being driven by these primal urges. The dog would become restless, distracted, less responsive to commands. His appetite would decrease, and he would spend long periods staring in the direction of the village, whining softly. These were the times when William's authority over his dog was most severely tested. The medieval approach to managing canine sexuality was typically practical and unsentimental. If a dog's mating instincts interfered too severely with his working ability, castration was the obvious solution. But this procedure was dangerous without modern veterinary knowledge, and many dogs died from infection or blood loss. William had chosen to keep Brochet intact, accepting the seasonal challenges in exchange for maintaining his dog's full strength and natural instincts. During Brechete's periods of romantic distraction, William had to work harder to maintain their partnership. He would increase the dog's workload, giving him more tasks to focus on and exhaust his excess energy. Long hunting expeditions served dual purposes. They provided food, and they tired Brechete enough that he could sleep through the night without whining about distant female scents. There were times when Brechete did disappear for a day or two, following his nose and his instincts to the village. William would spend these periods in anxious worry, knowing that his dog might be killed in fights with other males, stolen by someone who recognized his value, or simply lost in unfamiliar territory. When Brechete finally returned, usually looking sheepish and exhausted, William's relief was mixed with anger and the need to re-establish their working relationship. These episodes tested the boundaries of their partnership in ways that revealed the true nature of their bond. William could punish Brechete for his absences, but he couldn't eliminate the natural drives that caused them. He had to find ways to work with his dog's nature rather than against it, accepting that even the most loyal companion had needs and desires that went beyond their shared work. The village social dynamics around dog ownership were complex and often tense. Every dog owner was competing for the same limited resources: scraps from the butcher, hunting grounds that weren't overexploited, safe spaces to work and train their animals. William's success with Brechete made him both respected and envied by other dog owners in the area. There was Geoffrey the baker, whose mastiff was strong enough to turn the bread ovens but too aggressive to work safely around customers. There was Agnes the widow, whose small terrier was excellent at catching rats but too timid to serve as a guard dog. There was Harold the forester, whose hunting hounds were superb trackers but required more food than most families could afford to provide. Each dog owner had made different compromises and faced different challenges. William's relationship with Brechete was seen as particularly successful because they had achieved a balance between the dog's natural abilities and the practical demands of their shared work. But this success came with its own burdens. William was frequently asked for advice about training problems, breeding decisions, and handling difficult situations with other people's dogs. The social pressure to maintain Brechete's reputation was constant and sometimes overwhelming. Every time they worked together in public, William was aware that their performance was being evaluated by potential customers, competitors, and critics. A mistake by Brechete could damage William's business prospects, while exceptional performance could lead to new opportunities and increased respect. This pressure affected how William trained and worked with Brechete. He couldn't afford to be patient with mistakes when other people were watching. He couldn't show weakness or uncertainty, even when he wasn't sure of the best approach to a problem. The public face of their partnership had to be confident and competent, even when the private reality was more complicated and uncertain. The religious aspects of medieval life also affected William's relationship with Brechete in ways that modern pet owners might find difficult to understand. The Catholic Church's teaching that animals had no souls created a theological framework that made it easier to justify harsh treatment of dogs, but it also created genuine moral confusion for people who clearly loved their animal companions. William struggled with these religious teachings, especially during times when he felt particularly close to Brechete. The dog's loyalty, intelligence, and apparent emotional responses seemed to contradict the Church's assertion that animals were merely soulless property. When Brechete showed what appeared to be grief after the death of one of their chickens, or joy when William returned from a trip, or fear during thunderstorms, it was difficult to believe that these responses were purely mechanical rather than evidence of some kind of inner life. The village priest, Father Edmund, had strong opinions about the proper relationship between humans and animals. He preached regularly about the dangers of becoming too attached to earthly creatures, warning that excessive love for animals could distract people from their duties to God and their fellow humans. According to Father Edmund, dogs were tools created by God for human use, nothing more and nothing less. But Father Edmund had never spent a winter alone, with only a dog for company. He had never depended on an animal's senses to detect danger, never shared his last crust of bread with a hungry companion, never felt the comfort of warm fur against his back on a freezing night. William's lived experience with Brachet contradicted the priest's theoretical teachings in ways that created genuine spiritual conflict. William found himself praying for Brachet's health and safety, then wondering if such prayers were appropriate for a soulless creature. He felt grateful to God for providing him with such a faithful companion, then questioned whether his gratitude should be directed toward the animal or only toward the divine creator who had made the animal possible. These theological puzzles had no clear answers, and William learned to live with the uncertainty rather than trying to resolve contradictions that wiser men than he had failed to explain. The practical medical care that William provided for Brachet was a mixture of folk wisdom, trial and error, and desperate improvisation. When Brachet developed a persistent cough during one particularly damp autumn, William treated him with the same herbal remedies he would use for his own respiratory problems. Teas made from horehound and colt's foot, poultices of heated herbs applied to the chest, and increased portions of warming foods like meat and fat. When Brachet injured his shoulder during a particularly vigorous hunt, William had to serve as both physician and nurse. He cleaned the wound with boiled water, applied honey as an antiseptic, and created a makeshift bandage from torn cloth. The healing process took weeks, during which William had to modify their work routine to accommodate Brachet's limitations while still maintaining their productivity and income. The most frightening medical crisis came when Brachet ate something that poisoned him, probably a piece of meat that had gone bad, though William never determined the exact cause. The dog became violently ill, vomiting repeatedly, and unable to keep down water or food. For 3 days, William thought he was going to lose his faithful companion. William's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his attachment to Brachet. He stayed awake around the clock, monitoring the dog's condition and trying different remedies. He forced small amounts of clean water down Brachet's throat to prevent dehydration. He prepared thin broths and tried to tempt the sick dog to eat. He even considered making the dangerous journey to the nearest town to consult with someone who might have more medical knowledge, though such help would have been expensive and might not have been available for a dog anyway. During those 3 terrible days, William faced the possibility of losing not just a working companion, but a friend who had shared his daily life for years. The prospect of returning to the isolation and vulnerability he had known before Brachet's arrival was almost unbearable. He found himself making bargains with God, promising to be more devout, more charitable, more grateful, if only his dog would recover. Brachet did recover slowly and gradually, though he was never quite as strong as he had been before the illness. The experience left both of them changed. William was more protective and attentive to his dog's health, while Brachet seemed to understand that he had been cared for during a time of helplessness and vulnerability. Their bond deepened even further, tempered by the shared experience of facing mortality together. The economic realities of medieval life meant that William's investment in Brachet's medical care had to be justified by the dog's continued productivity. A dog that couldn't work was a liability, regardless of emotional attachments. William had to balance his growing affection for Brachet against the cold calculations of survival. Every expense, every hour spent caring for the dog rather than working, every portion of food shared with an animal had to be weighed against the practical benefits of maintaining their partnership. This economic pressure created a harsh but honest framework for their relationship. William's care for Brachet was genuine, but it was also rational. He invested in the dog's health and well-being because Braquet's continued work was essential to both their survival. The dog, in turn, seemed to understand that his security depended on his ability to contribute to their shared enterprise. The seasonal rhythms of their work created a natural cycle of intense cooperation, followed by periods of relative rest. During the busy harvest season, William and Brachette would work from dawn to dusk, processing grain for farmers throughout the region. Brachette's help with moving heavy sacks, operating smaller equipment, and guarding valuable grain was essential during these profitable but exhausting periods. But winter brought a different rhythm. Long periods of inactivity, punctuated by intense episodes of hunting, foraging, or dealing with emergencies. During these quiet times, the relationship between William and Braquet became more companionate and less strictly professional. They would sit by the fire together in the evenings, with William perhaps carving wooden implements or repairing tools while Braquet dozed at his feet. These peaceful interludes were precious, partly because they were so rare. Most of medieval life was characterized by constant work, chronic insecurity, and the ever-present threat of disaster. The moments when William could simply enjoy Brachette's company, without worrying about productivity or survival, were stolen pleasures that made the hardships more bearable. As the years passed, and both William and Brachette aged, their relationship evolved to accommodate changing physical capabilities and shifting needs. William's joints became stiffer, making the physical demands of mill work more challenging. Brachette's hearing wasn't as sharp as it once was, and his tracking abilities had declined slightly, but their partnership deepened as they learned to compensate for each other's limitations. William began to rely more heavily on Brachette's remaining strengths, while taking over tasks that had become too difficult for the aging dog. Brachette could no longer chase rabbits effectively, but his experience and wisdom made him even better at detecting the subtle signs that indicated good hunting grounds. William's knowledge of the local terrain and weather patterns complemented Brachette's instinctive understanding of animal behavior. Their communication became more sophisticated as well, refined by years of working together in challenging conditions. A slight change in Brachette's posture could tell William that something was wrong, even before the dog barked or whined. A particular whistle pattern from William could convey complex instructions that Brachette would understand and execute without further guidance. This mature phase of their partnership was characterized by a kind of wordless efficiency that could only come from years of shared experience. They had developed their own private language of gestures, sounds, and behaviors that allowed them to work together seamlessly, even in difficult or dangerous situations. Their trust in each other was absolute. William knew that Brachet would never fail him deliberately, while Brachet understood that William's decisions were always made with both their best interests in mind. The reality of Brachet's eventual death was something William had to face long before it actually occurred. Medieval dogs rarely lived beyond 8 or 10 years, and Brachet was already showing signs of the arthritis, tooth loss, and general weakness that came with age. William began to prepare himself emotionally for the loss, while also starting to think practically about finding a replacement. But the prospect of replacing Brachet felt like a betrayal of their partnership. No other dog could know William's routines, understand his particular needs, or share the accumulated experiences that had shaped their relationship. A new dog would have to be trained from scratch, and there was no guarantee that such a deep bond could be formed again. When William reached out in the darkness to touch Brachet's warm fur, he wasn't just seeking comfort, he was confirming that his partner, his protector, his friend was still there, still breathing, still ready to face whatever challenges the next day might bring. But he was also treasuring these moments of contact, knowing that they were numbered and precious beyond measure. It's a sweltering July morning in 1298, and you're Margaret the Brewster, standing over a massive wooden vat filled with bubbling, fermenting barley. The air around you is thick with the yeasty smell of beer in the making, and your clothes are already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. In your hand is a wooden ladle, and you're about to take your first drink of the day. Not water, mind you, but a thin, sour beer that tastes like liquid bread and contains just enough alcohol to kill the invisible demons that lurk in every drop of water in your medieval world. This isn't about medieval people being a bunch of perpetually drunk farmers stumbling around their fields in an alcoholic haze. This is about survival in a world where the difference between clean beer and contaminated water could mean the difference between living to see harvest time and dying of dysentery in a ditch somewhere. Your bowels emptied and your body racked with fever as the bad water literally kills you from the inside out. Let's start with the most fundamental misunderstanding about medieval drinking habits. The idea that people didn't drink water because they didn't know it could be clean. Medieval people weren't idiots. They knew perfectly well that some water sources were safer than others. They could see the difference between a clear mountain spring and the murky, foul-smelling water that collected in village wells after months of people dumping their chamber pots nearby. They knew that drinking from a stream downstream from a tannery was asking for trouble, and they understood that water that tasted strange or smelled bad was probably dangerous. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was infrastructure, or rather, the complete lack of infrastructure. There were no water treatment plants, no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no way to reliably purify large quantities of water for daily consumption. Even when you found a good water source, there was no guarantee it would stay good. A dead animal upstream, human waste from a passing army, runoff from a blacksmith's shop, any of these could contaminate your water supply without warning. Margaret knows all this because she's buried 2 children who died from the bloody flux after drinking bad water. She's seen grown men reduced to skin and bones by diseases that came from contaminated wells. She's watched entire households fall sick after a particularly wet season filled their cisterns with runoff that looked clean but carried death in every sip. These aren't abstract concerns for Margaret. They're lived experiences that have shaped every decision she makes about what her family drinks. So Margaret brews beer, not because she's an alcoholic, not because she doesn't understand the concept of clean water, but because fermentation is the most reliable method available to her for creating safe drinks. The alcohol content doesn't need to be high, just enough to create an environment where the dangerous microorganisms can't survive. We're talking about beer that might be only 2 to 3% alcohol, sometimes even less. It's more like alcoholic soup than what we'd recognize as beer today. The brewing process itself is a complex dance of timing, temperature, and ingredients that Margaret has learned through years of trial and error. She starts before dawn, heating water in large iron cauldrons over an open fire. The water has to be hot enough to kill whatever nasties might be lurking in it, but not so hot that it destroys the enzymes that will convert the grain starches into fermentable sugars. This is chemistry, even though Margaret doesn't know that word. She's learned to judge the temperature by how the steam looks, how the water sounds as it heats, how long she can hold her hand over the surface without burning. Once the water reaches the right temperature, Margaret adds malted barley that she's prepared herself. The malting process involves soaking barley in water until it starts to sprout, then drying it with heat to stop the germination. This creates enzymes that will break down the grain's starches into sugars that yeast can consume. Margaret doesn't understand the science behind this process, but she knows the signs of properly malted grain, the smell, the texture, the way it behaves when mixed with hot water. The mashing process takes hours of careful stirring and temperature control. Margaret has to maintain the mixture at just the right heat to allow the enzymes to work without killing them. Too hot, and the enzymes die. Too cool, and they work too slowly. The timing is critical because Margaret has other work to do: bread to bake, meals to prepare, children to tend. Brewing is just one of many tasks that fill her impossibly busy days. After mashing comes the process of separating the liquid wort from the spent grain. Margaret pours the mixture through a strainer made of woven reeds, collecting the sweet, cloudy liquid that will become beer. The leftover grain isn't wasted. It goes to feed the pigs or gets mixed into bread dough. Nothing is ever wasted in Margaret's world, because waste is a luxury that can mean the difference between surviving the winter and starving before spring arrives. The wort then goes into fermentation vessels, large wooden barrels or ceramic pots that Margaret has carefully cleaned and prepared. She adds yeast, though she doesn't call it that. To Margaret, it's the balm or God is good, a mysterious substance that makes the beer bubble and foam and transforms sweet liquid into something that won't kill you. Sometimes she uses yeast saved from previous batches. Sometimes she relies on wild yeast from the air. And sometimes she gets fresh yeast from other brewers in the village. The fermentation process is where the magic happens, though Margaret understands it more as a kind of controlled rot than as the complex biochemical process it actually is. The yeast consumes the sugars in the wort, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide as waste products. The alcohol is what makes the beer safe to drink, while the carbon dioxide creates the slight fizz that tells Margaret the fermentation is proceeding properly. But fermentation is also where things can go terribly wrong. If the vessels aren't clean, bad bacteria can contaminate the batch and create beer that's not only undrinkable, but actually dangerous. If the temperature is wrong, the yeast might not work properly, leaving you with sweet, unfermented liquid that will spoil quickly. If you add too much or too little yeast, the beer might be too strong, too weak, or might not ferment at all. Margaret has lost entire batches to contamination, spoilage, and simple bad luck. Each failed batch represents not just wasted ingredients, but wasted time and lost opportunities to create the safe drinks her family needs. In a world where resources are scarce and margin for error is minimal, brewing failures can have serious consequences for survival. The variety of beers that Margaret produces is staggering by modern standards. There's the light, weak beer that children drink, barely alcoholic, but safe and nourishing. There's the stronger beer for adults, with enough alcohol content to kill dangerous organisms, but not enough to impair judgment or work performance. There's the thick, porridge-like beer made with oats or rye when barley is scarce. There's the herbed beer flavoured with whatever medicinal plants Margaret can gather: horehound for coughs, chamomile for stomach troubles, nettle for general health. Each type of beer requires different techniques, different ingredients, and different timing. Margaret has to adjust her recipes based on what grains are available, what the weather has been like, how much fuel she has for heating water, and what her family's particular needs are at any given time. A sick child might need a gentler, more nutritious beer. A husband heading out for hard physical labour might need something stronger and more sustaining. The seasonal rhythms of brewing follow the agricultural calendar in ways that shape Margaret's entire year. Spring is for light beers made with the last of the stored grain and whatever fresh herbs are starting to emerge. Summer brings the challenge of keeping beer from spoiling in the heat. Margaret has to brew more frequently, but in smaller batches, and she has to find cool places to store the finished product. Autumn is the busiest time, when the new grain harvest allows for brewing the strong, dark beers that will last through winter. Winter brewing is limited by the availability of fuel for heating water and the difficulty of maintaining proper fermentation temperatures in cold weather. The economics of medieval brewing were complex, and crucial to understanding why beer became so central to daily life. Grain was expensive, but beer was more nutritious and longer lasting than bread made from the same amount of grain. A gallon of beer could provide significant calories and nutrients, and it wouldn't spoil as quickly as fresh bread in a world without refrigeration. For families like Margaret's, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a food source, a way of preserving grain, and a hedge against starvation. Margaret's brewing also generates income for her family. She sells beer to travellers, to villagers who don't brew their own, and to the local lord's household when they need extra supplies for feasts or festivals. Brewing is one of the few trades where women could operate relatively independently, earning money that gave them some degree of economic autonomy in a world where women's options were severely limited. But the business of brewing comes with its own risks and challenges. Margaret has to navigate complex regulations about who can brew, where beer can be sold, and what quality standards must be met. The local authorities regularly inspect her brewing operation, testing her beer for strength and purity. Failure to meet these standards can result in fines, loss of brewing privileges, or even accusations of trying to poison customers. The guild system that governs brewing in larger towns creates additional layers of complexity. Master brewers jealously guard their techniques and recipes, passing them down through apprenticeships that can last for years. Margaret, operating in a small village, doesn't have access to these formal training systems. She's learned her craft from her mother and grandmother, supplemented by trial and error and whatever tips she can pick up from other brewers when they meet at markets or festivals. The social aspects of beer consumption in medieval times were just as important as the practical ones. Beer was the drink of hospitality. Offering beer to guests was a basic requirement of courtesy, and the quality of your beer reflected on your household's prosperity and skill. Margaret takes pride in her brewing, not just because it keeps her family healthy, but because it establishes her reputation as a competent, resourceful woman worthy of respect. The ale house that Margaret sometimes supplies is the social centre of village life. It's where news is shared, business is conducted, disputes are settled, and community bonds are formed. The quality of the beer served there affects not just the health of the drinkers, but the entire social fabric of the community. Bad beer can lead to sickness that disrupts work and family life. Good beer contributes to the kind of social cohesion that helps communities survive the constant challenges of medieval life. But beer consumption also creates social problems that Margaret witnesses regularly. While most beer is weak enough to allow for normal functioning, stronger brews can lead to drunkenness, violence, and poor decision-making. Margaret has seen fights break out over beer debts, marriages strained by excessive drinking, and work left undone because someone spent too much time at the alehouse. The line between necessary consumption and harmful overindulgence is one that every medieval person has to navigate carefully. The religious attitudes toward beer consumption are complex and sometimes contradictory. The Church teaches moderation in all things, but it also recognizes that beer is often the safest available drink. Many monasteries operate their own breweries, producing beer not just for their own consumption, but for sale to the surrounding communities. The monks have developed some of the most sophisticated brewing techniques of the medieval period, treating their craft as a form of service to God and their fellow humans. Margaret's own relationship with beer consumption is shaped by these religious teachings. She drinks beer throughout the day because she has to, but she's careful not to drink so much that she becomes intoxicated. She teaches her children to understand the difference between drinking for safety and drinking for pleasure, emphasizing that beer is medicine and food first, and enjoyment second. The daily rhythm of beer consumption in Margaret's household follows practical rather than recreational patterns. She starts the day with a small cup of weak beer, just enough to provide safe hydration and a few calories to start the morning's work. Throughout the day, family members drink beer with meals, using it to wash down bread and whatever other food is available. The beer provides not just liquid, but significant nutrition, B vitamins from the yeast, carbohydrates from the grain, and minerals from the water used in brewing. Children in Margaret's household start drinking weak beer almost as soon as they're weaned from breast milk. This isn't child abuse, it's child safety. The alternative is giving them water that might kill them. Margaret carefully controls the strength of the beer her children consume, making sure it's strong enough to be safe, but weak enough not to affect their behavior or development. She's learned to judge the right balance through years of experience and occasional mistakes. The storage and preservation of beer creates constant challenges for Margaret. Without refrigeration, beer spoils quickly, especially in warm weather. She has to time her brewing carefully to ensure that fresh beer is always available without wastage. Too much beer sitting around goes sour or develops off flavors. Too little beer means running out at crucial times when brewing isn't possible. Margaret stores her beer in wooden barrels, ceramic jugs, and leather containers, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. Wooden barrels are good for long-term storage, but can impart flavors that change the taste of the beer. Ceramic jugs are neutral in flavor, but fragile and expensive. Leather containers are portable and relatively cheap, but can develop leaks and are difficult to clean thoroughly. The seasonal availability of ingredients forces Margaret to be creative and adaptable in her brewing. When barley is scarce, she might brew with oats, rye, or even wheat. When traditional brewing herbs are unavailable, she experiments with whatever plants she can gather or grow. Each substitution changes the flavor, nutritional content, and keeping qualities of the beer, requiring Margaret to adjust her techniques and expectations. The process of malting grain is particularly challenging because it requires precise timing and constant attention. Margaret has to soak the grain until it just begins to sprout, then dry it quickly to stop the germination process. Too little sprouting and the enzymes won't develop properly. Too much sprouting and the grain uses up its stored energy before it can be converted to beer. The timing varies depending on the type of grain, the temperature, the humidity, and dozens of other factors that Margaret has learned to judge through experience. Water quality remains a constant concern throughout the brewing process. Even though the boiling and fermentation will make the final product safe, starting with the cleanest possible water produces better tasting and longer lasting beer. Margaret has to evaluate water sources constantly, testing them by taste, smell, and appearance. She's learned to recognize the signs of water that's been contaminated by human waste, animal activity, or industrial processes like tanning or metalworking. The fuel requirements for brewing are substantial and expensive. Margaret needs enough wood or other combustible material to heat large quantities of water to specific temperatures for extended periods. In areas where fuel is scarce, this can make brewing prohibitively expensive. Margaret has to balance the cost of fuel against the necessity of producing safe drinks, sometimes choosing to brew less frequently or in smaller batches to conserve resources. The labor involved in brewing is intensive and time-consuming. Margaret can't just set up a batch and walk away. Brewing requires constant monitoring, stirring, temperature adjustment, and decision-making. This labor competes with all the other demands on her time: cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile production, garden work, and helping with agricultural tasks. The time spent brewing is time not spent on other essential activities. The knowledge required for successful brewing is extensive and constantly evolving. Margaret has to understand the properties of different grains, the behavior of yeast under various conditions, the effects of temperature and timing on fermentation, the impact of different water sources on final flavor, and the complex interactions between all these variables. This knowledge isn't written down anywhere. It's passed along through oral tradition, personal experimentation, and careful observation of cause and effect. The quality control challenges of medieval brewing are immense. Margaret has no scientific instruments to measure alcohol content, acidity, or bacterial contamination. She has to rely on her senses, taste, smell, appearance, and sound, to judge whether a batch is proceeding correctly. She's learned to recognize the signs of successful fermentation, the warnings of impending spoilage, and the characteristics of beer that's safe to drink versus beer that might be dangerous. The social pressure to produce consistently good beer is intense. Margaret's reputation as a brewer affects not just her family's income, but their standing in the community. Poor beer can lead to lost customers, damaged relationships, and even accusations of incompetence or malicious intent. In a small village where everyone knows everyone else, a brewing failure can have consequences that last for years. The seasonal variations in demand for beer create additional challenges for Margaret's planning and production. Harvest time brings increased demand as workers need more liquid refreshment. Religious festivals and community celebrations require special brews and larger quantities. Winter illness outbreaks increase demand for medicinal beers. Margaret has to anticipate these fluctuations and plan her brewing schedule accordingly. The transportation of beer from brewery to consumer is fraught with difficulties. Beer is heavy, fragile, and perishable. Moving it any significant distance requires careful packaging, gentle handling, and speed to prevent spoilage. Margaret often has to choose between serving a wider market and maintaining quality control, because the farther beer travels, the more likely it is to arrive in poor condition. The competition between brewers creates both challenges and opportunities for Margaret. Other brewers might offer lower prices, better quality, or more convenient service, but competition also drives innovation and improvement, pushing Margaret to refine her techniques and develop new products. The brewing community is small enough that brewers often share information and help each other solve problems, but large enough that commercial competition is real and sometimes fierce. The legal framework governing brewing varies from place to place and changes over time, creating constant uncertainty for Margaret. New regulations might restrict who can brew, where beer can be sold, what ingredients can be used, or what prices can be charged. Violation of these regulations can result in fines, imprisonment, or loss of brewing privileges. Margaret has to stay informed about changing laws while focusing on the technical and commercial aspects of her business. The health effects of daily beer consumption are something Margaret observes constantly in her family and community. Most people seem to thrive on a diet that includes significant amounts of weak beer, but some individuals develop problems with stronger brews or excessive consumption. Margaret has learned to adjust the strength and quantity of beer for different family members based on their age, health status, and individual tolerance. The environmental impact of brewing is significant in a world where resources are scarce and waste disposal is primitive. Brewing requires large quantities of water, fuel, and grain. It produces substantial amounts of spent grain, used yeast, and wastewater. Margaret has to find uses for these byproducts, or ways to dispose of them without creating health hazards or community conflicts. As Margaret ladles up another cup of her thin, life-sustaining beer on this hot July morning, she's participating in a survival strategy that has kept her ancestors alive for generations. Every sip represents a victory over the invisible threats that lurk in contaminated water. Every successful batch is a hedge against starvation and disease. This isn't about getting drunk, This is about staying alive in a world where the difference between safe and unsafe drinks can mean the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming another casualty of medieval life's countless dangers. The bubbling vat before her contains not just fermented grain and water, but the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of brewers who learned through trial, error, and sometimes tragedy how to transform dangerous water into life-sustaining beer. Margaret drinks deeply, tasting the slightly sour, yeasty flavor that means safety, nutrition, and another day of survival in a world where tomorrow is never guaranteed. It's 3:30 in the morning on a November night in 1284, and you're being shaken awake by Brother Francis, whose breath smells like old cheese and whose hands are as cold as the stone floor you've been sleeping on. Your name is Thomas, you're barely 14 years old, and you've been living in Whitmore Abbey for exactly 4 months and 12 days. Not that you're counting or anything. The bell is tolling for matins, the first prayer service of the day, and your wool habit is still damp from yesterday's rain, because nobody thought to explain to you that the youngest monk gets the spot nearest the leaky roof. This isn't some romantic notion of peaceful monastic life filled with illuminated manuscripts and holy contemplation. This is survival in an institution designed by adults for adults, where being the youngest means you're automatically the least important person in a rigid hierarchy that governs everything, from where you stand during prayers to what you eat for breakfast, if you're lucky enough to get breakfast at all. Thomas stumbles to his feet, his legs still weak from the growth spurt that hit him just before he entered the abbey. His mother had sent him here not out of religious devotion, but because there were too many mouths to feed at home, and the abbey represented one less expense, and maybe, if God was merciful, a path to literacy and influence that a peasant's son could never hope to achieve elsewhere. But right now, shivering in the darkness with his stomach growling and his head still foggy with sleep, Thomas is wondering if his mother's practical decision was actually a death sentence delivered slowly, one miserable day at a time. The dormitory where Thomas sleeps is a long, narrow stone hall lined with simple wooden beds, though calling them beds is generous. They're more like wooden platforms with thin straw mattresses that provide about as much comfort as sleeping on a pile of rocks. Thomas's bed is positioned at the far end of the dormitory, as far as possible from the small brazier that provides the only heat in the room. This isn't an accident. It's a deliberate reminder of his status as the newest and lowest ranking member of the community. The Abbey operates on a strict schedule that begins before dawn and continues until well after sunset. Thomas has had to memorize not just the timing of 8 daily prayer services, but also the complex rules governing who stands where, who speaks when, and who gets to eat what during the brief intervals between religious obligations. As the youngest monk, Thomas is always last to enter the chapel, last to receive food, last to be told what his daily work assignments will be, and last to receive any kind of attention or guidance from the senior brothers. Brother Francis, who serves as Thomas's mentor and taskmaster, is a thin, perpetually irritated man in his 40s, who seems to view the training of young monks as a personal punishment inflicted by God for some unremembered sin. Francis has made it clear that he expects Thomas to learn through observation and trial and error rather than through patient instruction. "Watch and learn, boy," is Francis's favourite phrase, usually delivered with a sharp cuff to the back of Thomas's head when he makes a mistake. The chapel where they gather for matins is a cavernous stone space that seems designed to make humans feel as small and insignificant as possible. In the darkness before dawn, lit only by a few flickering candles, the shadows seem to move and shift in ways that make Thomas's skin crawl. The Latin chants that echo off the stone walls are beautiful in a haunting sort of way. But Thomas understands perhaps one word in 10, and the complex melodies are still beyond his ability to follow accurately. Thomas's voice is changing, which creates additional humiliation during the singing portions of the services. One moment he's hitting the notes correctly, the next his voice cracks into an embarrassing squeak that draws disapproving looks from the older monks. Brother Francis has taken to positioning himself directly behind Thomas during services, ready to deliver a sharp elbow to the ribs whenever Thomas's voice betrays him at a particularly sacred moment. The hierarchy of the Abbey is as rigid and unforgiving as any military organization. At the top is the abbot, Dom Benedict, a powerful man in his 60s who rarely acknowledges Thomas's existence, except to nod slightly when Thomas performs his duties correctly. Below the abbot are the senior monks, each with specialized responsibilities: the prior, who manages daily operations; the cellarer, who oversees supplies and finances; the infirmarian, who tends to the sick; the cantor, who leads the music; and the novice master, who is supposed to train new monks, but who seems more interested in finding fault than providing instruction. Thomas occupies the very bottom of this hierarchy, below even the other novices who arrived before him. His daily routine is shaped by this status in ways both large and small. He wakes earlier than the others to help prepare for matins. He stays later after each service to clean up and organize. He gets the most uncomfortable positions during long prayer sessions. He receives the smallest portions at meals and the oldest, most worn-out equipment for his work assignments. The work that fills the hours between prayer services is backbreaking and monotonous in ways that Thomas's previous life as a peasant's son had never prepared him for. In the fields at home, there was at least variety, different crops, different seasons, different tasks that required different skills. In the Abbey, Thomas's work assignments are deliberately designed to teach humility and obedience rather than useful skills. His primary job is working in the scriptorium, but not in the way that romantic notions of monastic life might suggest. Thomas doesn't get to copy beautiful illuminated manuscripts or engage in scholarly pursuits. Instead, he spends hours each day preparing writing materials, mixing ink from oak galls and iron sulfate, preparing vellum by scraping and stretching animal skins, cutting and sharpening quills, and cleaning up after the senior monks who do the actual writing. The ink-making process is particularly tedious and messy. Thomas has to gather oak galls from the forest, crush them with a mortar and pestle, boil them with water to extract the tannins, then mix the resulting liquid with iron sulfate and gum arabic to create a ink that won't fade over time. His hands are permanently stained black from this work, and the chemical smell of the ink-making process has seeped into his clothes and hair so thoroughly that he can taste it even when he's sleeping. The vellum preparation is even worse. Thomas has to take raw animal skins, usually sheep or calf, and transform them into smooth writing surfaces through a process that involves soaking, scraping, stretching, and polishing. The smell of wet animal hide is overwhelming, and the physical work of scraping away fat and hair with sharp tools leaves Thomas's arms and shoulders aching at the end of each day. The senior monks, who benefit from his work, rarely acknowledge his efforts, treating the prepared vellum as if it appeared through divine intervention rather than through hours of Thomas's labor. The quill preparation might seem like the easiest task, but it requires precision and patience that Thomas is still developing. Each feather has to be selected for the right size and flexibility, then stripped, shaped, and cut to create a writing implement that will hold ink properly and create consistent lines. Thomas cuts himself regularly on the sharp knife used for this work, and his early attempts at quill making produced implements that either held too much ink and created blots, or held too little ink and created faint, broken lines. Between his work in the scriptorium and his religious obligations, Thomas also has to participate in the general maintenance of the abbey. This means hauling water from the well, carrying firewood, cleaning the refectory after meals, tending the vegetable gardens, and helping with whatever seasonal tasks need to be completed. As the youngest monk, Thomas gets assigned to the most unpleasant of these jobs, mucking out the latrine, cleaning the fish pond, scrubbing the kitchen pots with sand and lye that leave his hands raw and cracked. The food in the abbey is adequate in quantity, but monotonous in variety, and Thomas's position at the bottom of the hierarchy means he often goes hungry, despite the official rules about equal portions. The senior monks eat first and take what they want, leaving the novices to share whatever remains. Thomas has learned to eat quickly when food is available, because hesitation often means going without. Breakfast, when it exists at all, usually consists of bread and ale, sometimes with a small portion of cheese or porridge. Dinner, the main meal of the day, typically includes bread, ale, a vegetable stew or soup, and occasionally fish or eggs. Supper is often just bread and whatever leftovers are available from dinner. The food is prepared by the abbey's lay workers under the supervision of the cellarer, and the emphasis is clearly on nutrition and economy rather than flavour or variety. The bread is dense, dark, and often slightly stale by the time Thomas gets to eat it. The ale is weak and sour, but it's safer than water and provides necessary calories. The vegetable stews are made from whatever is growing in the abbey gardens or can be gathered from the surrounding forests, cabbage, onions, turnips, beans and herbs that Thomas is still learning to identify. Fish comes from the abbey's own ponds when they can catch it, or from local streams when they can't. Eggs are a rare treat that usually goes to the senior monks. The rules governing meals are as complex as those governing prayer services. Thomas has to wait for a signal before sitting, another signal before beginning to eat, and yet another signal before stopping. No talking is allowed during meals. Instead, one of the monks reads aloud from religious texts, while the others eat in silence. Thomas finds it difficult to concentrate on both the reading and his food, especially when he's particularly hungry, and the text is in Latin that he doesn't fully understand. The sleeping arrangements in the dormitory are designed to reinforce the abbey's spiritual goals while testing the endurance of its residents. Each monk has a simple wooden bed with a straw mattress, a single wool blanket, and a small wooden chest for personal belongings, though novices like Thomas are discouraged from accumulating personal possessions of any kind. The beds are arranged in strict order of seniority, with Thomas's bed positioned where he gets the least warmth, the most noise from late arriving monks, and the maximum exposure to drafts from poorly sealed windows. Sleep is a precious commodity that Thomas never gets enough of. The day begins at 3:30 a.m. with matins, and doesn't truly end until after compline at 8 p.m. But even then there are often additional duties that keep Thomas awake past the official bedtime. The thin mattress and single blanket provide little comfort, and the constant cold of the stone building seeps into his bones no matter how tightly he curls up under his covers. The other novices in the abbey are a mixed group with varying backgrounds and motivations for joining the religious life. There's Brother Mark, who arrived 6 months before Thomas and takes every opportunity to remind him of his superior status. Mark comes from a merchant family and clearly expects his eventual rise through the abbey hierarchy to be swift and certain. He treats Thomas with the kind of casual disdain that comes from being born into higher social status. Brother Peter arrived 2 months before Thomas and represents something closer to Thomas's own background, a peasant's son sent to the abbey more for practical than spiritual reasons. Peter has adapted to abbey life by becoming aggressively obedient, following every rule precisely, and reporting any infractions by other novices to the senior monks. This strategy has earned him slightly better treatment, but it's also made him friendless and isolated. Brother David is the newest arrival after Thomas, having entered the Abbey just 3 weeks ago. David is clearly struggling with the transition from secular to religious life. He cries himself to sleep most nights, makes frequent mistakes during services, and seems constantly on the verge of asking to be released from his vows. Thomas feels sympathy for David, but also relief that he's no longer the newest and most vulnerable member of the community. The relationships between the novices are complicated by the competitive atmosphere that the Abbey's hierarchy creates. Each novice knows that advancement depends on gaining the approval of the senior monks, and this creates incentives for backstabbing, tale-telling, and deliberate sabotage of fellow novices. Thomas has to be constantly careful about what he says and does in front of the other novices, because any mistake or sign of weakness can be reported to Brother Francis or other authority figures. The education that Thomas receives in the Abbey is simultaneously more and less than what his family hoped for when they sent him there. On the positive side, he's learning to read and write Latin, skills that are virtually impossible for a peasant's son to acquire elsewhere. He's also being exposed to religious texts, philosophical concepts, and ways of thinking about the world that go far beyond the practical concerns of agricultural life. But the educational process is harsh, unforgiving, and focused more on memorization than understanding. Thomas spends hours each day reciting Latin prayers that he doesn't fully comprehend, copying texts whose meaning is never explained to him, and participating in discussions that are really just opportunities for senior monks to demonstrate their learning while novices listen in silence. Brother Augustine, who serves as the Abbey's teacher, believes that learning should be difficult and uncomfortable. He regularly beats students who make mistakes, assigns punishments for incorrect pronunciation, and creates an atmosphere of fear and anxiety around intellectual pursuits. Thomas has learned to be very careful about asking questions because curiosity is often interpreted as pride or disrespect. The library in the Abbey is simultaneously magnificent and frustrating for Thomas. The collection includes hundreds of books, more texts than Thomas could have imagined existing in the entire world. There are religious works, philosophical treatises, historical chronicles, and even some texts on practical subjects like agriculture and medicine. But Thomas is allowed to handle only the most basic texts, and only under close supervision. The beautiful illuminated manuscripts and rare texts remain tantalizingly out of reach. Thomas's daily schedule is rigidly structured around the 8 canonical hours of prayer: matins at 3:30 a.m., lauds at dawn, prime at 6 a.m., terce at 9 a.m., sext at noon, none at 3 p.m., vespers at sunset, and compline at 8 p.m. Between these services, there are assigned work periods, meals, and brief rest periods, but the overall effect is a day so structured that Thomas rarely has a moment to himself. The physical demands of Abbey life are considerable. Thomas is on his feet for most of his waking hours, walking between the dormitory, chapel, scriptorium, refectory, and various work locations. The stone floors are hard on his feet and legs, and the cold, damp air aggravates the joint pain that seems to affect everyone who lives in the Abbey. The poor nutrition and chronic fatigue leave Thomas feeling weak and dizzy more often than he cares to admit. The emotional challenges are even more difficult to bear. Thomas misses his family terribly, but contact with the outside world is strictly limited. He's allowed to receive letters from home only occasionally, and he's forbidden from sending messages without permission from Brother Francis. The isolation from everything familiar, combined with the constant stress of trying to meet impossible standards, creates a feeling of despair that Thomas struggles to overcome. The religious instruction that Thomas receives is designed to break down his individual will and rebuild him as an obedient servant of God and the Church. This process involves constant criticism, deliberate humiliation, and the systematic destruction of any sense of personal autonomy or self-worth. Thomas is taught that his own thoughts, desires, and opinions are inherently sinful, and that salvation depends on complete submission to authority. Brother Francis regularly reminds Thomas that he's worthless without God's grace, that his presence in the Abbey is an undeserved privilege, and that any suffering he experiences is both deserved and beneficial for his spiritual development. This psychological pressure is relentless and designed to create the kind of total obedience that the Abbey system requires to function. The seasonal rhythms of Abbey life create different challenges and opportunities throughout the year. Winter is the most difficult time, with shortened daylight hours making the prayer schedule even more grueling. Cold temperatures making work assignments more uncomfortable, and limited food supplies creating additional stress about nutrition and survival. Spring brings relief from the cold, but increased work in the gardens and fields. Thomas spends long hours planting, weeding, and tending crops that will feed the Abbey community. This outdoor work is physically demanding, but also provides welcome relief from the confinement of indoor duties. The longer daylight hours make the prayer schedule less disruptive to natural sleep patterns. Summer is perhaps the most bearable season, with warm weather making the cold stone buildings more comfortable and abundant food supplies reducing concerns about hunger. But summer also brings increased demands for agricultural work, leaving Thomas exhausted from long days of physical labour in addition to his regular duties. Autumn combines the benefits of harvest abundance with the anxiety of preparing for winter. Thomas participates in preserving food, gathering fuel, and making repairs to buildings and equipment. The knowledge that winter is approaching creates a sense of urgency that affects everyone in the Abbey. The medical care available in the Abbey is primitive by modern standards, but relatively advanced for the medieval period. Brother Oswald, the infirmarian, has accumulated knowledge about herbal remedies, basic surgical procedures, and disease treatment through years of experience and study of ancient texts. But his resources are limited, and many conditions that modern medicine could easily treat are either ignored or treated with methods that are sometimes more harmful than helpful. Thomas has experienced the Abbey's medical care firsthand when he developed a persistent cough during his second month. Brother Oswald's treatment involved bloodletting to remove excess humours, herbal teas that tasted terrible and had no apparent effect, and dietary restrictions that left Thomas even weaker than before. The cough eventually went away on its own, but Thomas learned to be very careful about reporting illness to the infirmarian. The psychological toll of Abbey life affects everyone differently. Some monks seem to thrive in the structured environment, finding genuine spiritual fulfillment in the prayers, work, and community life. Others, like Thomas, struggle with the isolation, authoritarianism, and physical hardships. A few monks clearly suffer from what modern people would recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions. But the Abbey's response to these problems is usually more prayer and stricter discipline, rather than any kind of therapeutic intervention. Thomas has witnessed several novices leave the Abbey after deciding that the religious life isn't for them. These departures are treated as failures of character or faith, rather than legitimate decisions about personal compatibility with monastic life. The monks who remain often speak of those who left with a mixture of pity and contempt, as if choosing to return to secular life is evidence of moral weakness. The political dynamics within the Abbey are complex and often hidden from novices like Thomas. Dom Benedict, the abbot, has to navigate relationships with local nobles, church authorities, and royal officials while managing the internal affairs of the Abbey. These external pressures sometimes create internal conflicts that affect the daily life of the community in ways that Thomas doesn't fully understand. The Abbey's economic situation is always precarious, dependent on donations from wealthy patrons, income from agricultural activities, and payments for services like copying manuscripts or saying masses for the dead. Thomas has overheard conversations between senior monks about financial problems, disputes with tenants, and concerns about maintaining the Abbey's buildings and operations. These economic pressures create additional stress for everyone in the community. The spiritual aspects of Abbey life are supposed to be the primary focus of everything that happens there, but Thomas finds it difficult to maintain genuine religious devotion when he's constantly hungry, cold, tired, and anxious about making mistakes. The prayers and services that should be sources of comfort and inspiration often feel like additional burdens to be endured rather than opportunities for spiritual growth. Thomas's relationship with God becomes complicated by the harsh realities of Abbey life. The senior monks teach that suffering is spiritually beneficial and that hardship is a sign of God's love, but Thomas struggles to reconcile this teaching with his daily experiences of unnecessary cruelty and institutional indifference. He finds himself questioning whether the God he's supposed to be serving really wants his followers to be miserable. The moments of genuine beauty and transcendence that occasionally occur in Abbey life stand out in sharp contrast to the daily routine of hardship and discipline. Sometimes during evening prayers, when the light from the setting sun streams through the chapel windows and the voices of the monks blend in perfect harmony, Thomas experiences something that might be called spiritual peace. These moments are rare and brief, but they remind him why some people choose the religious life voluntarily. The skills that Thomas is developing in the Abbey will serve him well if he chooses to remain in religious life, but they have limited value in the secular world. His literacy is valuable, but his practical experience is all related to religious activities. His knowledge of Latin is useful for scholarly pursuits, but most of the world conducts business in vernacular languages. His training in obedience and humility might make him a good servant, but it doesn't prepare him for independent decision-making or leadership. As Thomas grows older and more experienced in Abbey life, he begins to understand some of the reasoning behind the harsh treatment of novices. The Abbey system is designed to test commitment and weed out those who aren't truly called to religious life. The hardships that seem pointlessly cruel to Thomas are actually serving a purpose. They ensure that only those with genuine dedication and resilience will advance to positions of responsibility within the community. But understanding the system doesn't make living within it any easier. Thomas still wakes up every morning dreading the day ahead, still goes to bed every night exhausted and discouraged, still questions whether he has the strength and faith necessary to survive until he's old enough to make an informed decision about his future. The other novices provide both companionship and competition in Thomas's daily life. Mark's arrogance and Peter's zealous rule-following are annoying, but they're also the closest things to friends that Thomas has in the Abbey. David's obvious misery is a constant reminder of Thomas's own struggles, but it also makes him feel slightly better about his own ability to adapt to Abbey life. The lay workers who serve the Abbey, cooks, gardeners, maintenance workers, and servants, represent a different relationship to the religious community. They live on Abbey grounds and participate in some religious activities, but they're not bound by the same strict rules as the monks. Thomas sometimes envies their freedom to speak during meals, to maintain relationships with family members, and to pursue practical skills that have value in the outside world. The visitors who come to the Abbey bring news from the outside world and reminders of the life Thomas left behind. Merchants, pilgrims, local nobles, and church officials all pass through the Abbey regularly, and their presence creates a temporary disruption in the routine that Thomas both welcomes and finds unsettling. These visitors represent possibilities and alternatives that Thomas isn't supposed to think about. As the seasons pass and Thomas becomes more experienced in Abbey life, he begins to develop coping strategies that make the hardships more bearable. He learns to find small pleasures in daily routines, the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the satisfaction of completing a difficult task correctly. He develops mental exercises that help him endure long prayer services and tedious work assignments. He becomes more skilled at anticipating and avoiding the mistakes that lead to punishment. But Thomas also begins to realize that adaptation to Abbey life might come at the cost of losing parts of himself that he values. The curiosity, independence, and emotional expressiveness that were natural parts of his personality are being systematically suppressed in favor of obedience, humility, and conformity. He wonders whether the person he's becoming in the Abbey is actually an improvement over the person he was before, or just a more manageable version for the institution's purposes. The question of whether to commit to lifelong religious vows looms over everything Thomas does in the Abbey. At 14, he's still several years away from making that decision, but the pressure to demonstrate commitment and progress toward that goal affects his daily life in countless ways. Every mistake is seen as evidence of insufficient dedication. Every success is evaluated as proof of growing spiritual maturity. The entire Abbey system is designed to push novices toward taking vows, and Thomas sometimes feels like he's being carried along by forces beyond his control. As Thomas kneels in the cold chapel during yet another pre-dawn prayer service, his knees aching against the stone floor and his stomach growling with hunger, he struggles to maintain the appearance of devout attention while his mind wanders to thoughts of home, family, and the life he might have had if his parents had been able to afford keeping him. The Latin words of the service wash over him like a familiar but incomprehensible tide, and he wonders whether the peace and purpose that seem to come so naturally to the senior monks will ever be his, or whether he's destined to spend the rest of his life going through the motions of devotion while feeling like an outsider in his own spiritual community. The bell for Lards begins to toll, signalling the end of matins and the beginning of another day in the endless cycle of prayer, work, and endurance that defines Thomas's existence as the youngest monk in Whitmore Abbey. He rises with the others, his legs stiff from kneeling, and prepares to face another day of challenges that will test his faith, his endurance, and his growing uncertainty about whether this life of deliberate hardship is truly the path to salvation, or simply an elaborate system for breaking the spirits of young men who had the misfortune to be born into families that couldn't afford to keep them. It's the third day of what will become a 2-week blizzard in January 1187, and you're Aldrich the farmer, standing at the single small window of your wattle and daub cottage, watching snow pile up against the wooden shutters until the world outside has disappeared entirely into a wall of white that reaches halfway up your door. The wind is howling through gaps in the walls with a sound like wolves crying, and you can feel the cold seeping through every crack and crevice, despite the fire that's been burning continuously in your central hearth. Your wife Mildred is rationing the last of the grain from your storage pit. Your 3 children are huddled together under every piece of cloth you own, and you're beginning to realize that this storm might be the thing that finally kills you all. This isn't some cozy winter wonderland where you get to sip hot cocoa and watch the snow fall through a glass window. This is a death trap that's slowly closing around your family, where every decision you make over the next 14 days will determine whether you see spring or whether your neighbours will find your frozen corpses when the snow finally melts. You're completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a space roughly the size of a modern garage with 5 other people, 3 chickens, 2 goats, and whatever rats have decided to share your winter quarters. The cottage that seemed adequate during the warmer months now feels like a poorly designed tomb. The walls are made of interwoven branches, covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that's supposed to keep out the wind, but clearly wasn't designed for a storm of this magnitude. Snow is actually blowing through gaps between the wattles, creating small drifts inside your home that you have to sweep out regularly to prevent them from becoming permanent additions to your living space. The roof is thatched with straw and supposed to be waterproof, but the weight of the accumulating snow is causing it to sag in places, and you can hear ominous creaking sounds that suggest the entire structure might collapse if the storm continues much longer. Water from melting snow is dripping through the thatch in several places, creating muddy puddles on your dirt floor that freeze into treacherous ice patches whenever the fire burns low. The single room that houses your entire family measures perhaps 12 feet by 16 feet, and it has to accommodate not just the 6 human beings, but also the livestock that you've brought inside to prevent them from freezing to death. The 2 goats are tethered near the door, where they provide some additional body heat, but also contribute their own particular aromas to an atmosphere that's already thick with smoke, human sweat, and the general odour of too many living creatures confined in too small a space. The 3 chickens are roosting on a makeshift perch that Aldrich built above the storage area, where they're supposed to be safe from predators, but where they also have a tendency to drop their waste directly onto the bags of grain below. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be a major problem, but when you're trapped indoors for weeks with limited cleaning options, every source of filth becomes a significant concern. Your food supplies, which seemed adequate when you went into winter storage, are now looking desperately insufficient for a siege of this duration. The grain pit outside is completely inaccessible under 6 feet of snow, and the smaller emergency stores inside the cottage represent perhaps 10 days' worth of food if you ration carefully. But rationing carefully means that everyone in the family is constantly hungry, constantly thinking about food, constantly calculating whether each meal might be bringing you closer to starvation. Mildred has taken over the responsibility of managing the food supplies, a job that requires the mathematical skills of an accountant and the wisdom of Solomon. She's divided the available grain into daily portions, then subdivided those portions to ensure that each family member gets enough to survive, but not enough to feel satisfied. The children, ages 6, 9 and 12, don't understand why they can't have more bread when there's clearly food still available, and their constant begging creates emotional stress that adds to the physical hardships. The bread that Mildred bakes on the hearth is dense, dark, and often contains ingredients that would never be used in normal times. She's stretching the grain by adding ground acorns, dried peas that were supposed to be saved for planting, and even bark from certain trees that can provide nutrition without poisoning the family. The resulting loaves are barely recognizable as bread, but they provide essential calories and create the psychological comfort of having proper meals, even when the meals are anything but normal. Water is another constant concern. The well outside is frozen solid, and even if Aldrich could reach it through the snow, the mechanism for drawing water is completely inaccessible. The family's water supply comes from melting snow, but this process requires precious fuel and produces water that tastes flat and somehow wrong. Mildred has to boil all the melted snow water to make it safe to drink, which uses even more of their limited firewood supply. The fuel situation is perhaps the most critical challenge facing the family. Aldrich had stockpiled what he thought was adequate firewood for the winter, but a storm of this magnitude requires the fire to burn continuously at a much higher level than normal. The woodpile outside is buried under snow that's too deep to navigate, and the emergency fuel supplies inside the cottage are being consumed at an alarming rate. Every piece of wood that goes into the fire represents a calculation about survival. Burn too much, and you run out of fuel before the storm ends. Burn too little, and someone might freeze to death during the night. Aldrich has started breaking up wooden tools and furniture to feed the fire, beginning with items that are least essential and working his way toward things that will be impossible to replace. The sleeping arrangements in the cottage are a complex negotiation between the need for warmth and the basic human desire for privacy and personal space. The entire family sleeps together on a platform of wooden planks covered with straw and whatever cloth and fur coverings they own. Body heat is shared communally, but this also means that no one can move or adjust their position without disturbing everyone else. The children sleep in the middle, where they're warmest, but also most confined. Aldrich and Mildred sleep on the outside edges, where they bear the brunt of the cold, but also have access to the fire if it needs to be tended during the night. The goats and chickens contribute their own body heat to the general warmth of the space, but they also create noise, smells, and unpredictable movements that make restful sleep nearly impossible. The psychological challenges of being trapped in such close quarters for weeks are as difficult as the physical hardships. Every family member's habits, mannerisms, and personal quirks become magnified and irritating when there's no escape from constant proximity. The children bicker and fight more than usual, partly from hunger and boredom, but also from the simple stress of having no privacy or personal space. Aldrich finds himself becoming irrationally angry about small things, the way his youngest son chews his food, the frequency with which his daughter asks questions, the particular sound his wife makes when she's thinking. These irritations are compounded by his own anxiety about whether his decisions about fuel and food are correct, whether the roof will hold, whether the storm will end before their supplies run out. Mildred struggles with the responsibility of keeping everyone fed while managing her own fears about their survival. She's constantly recalculating food supplies, trying to stretch meals without making the portions so small that people become too weak to function. She also has to maintain morale and discipline among the children while dealing with her own growing sense of desperation. The work that continues even during the storm is essential for survival, but also provides psychological relief from the anxiety of simply waiting for conditions to improve. Someone has to tend the fire around the clock, which means that family members take shifts, staying awake to add fuel and adjust the airflow. Someone has to care for the animals, providing them with food and water, and cleaning up their waste. Someone has to monitor the structural integrity of the cottage, listening for sounds that might indicate impending collapse. The daily routine that develops during the siege is both comforting and oppressive. Everyone wakes at roughly the same time, not because of any external schedule, but because the fire needs to be built up after burning low during the night. Breakfast is a small portion of bread and whatever liquid is available, melted snow water, thin soup made from vegetable scraps, or occasionally milk from the goats if they're producing enough to spare. The morning hours are spent on essential maintenance tasks, tending animals, checking the roof for problems, reorganizing supplies, and attempting to repair tools or clothing with whatever materials are available. The middle of the day is the warmest time, when the fire has been burning long enough to heat the space and before the cold of evening begins to seep in. Afternoon activities focus on food preparation and planning. Mildred works on stretching the available ingredients into something resembling a meal, while Aldrich evaluates their remaining supplies and tries to calculate how much longer they can survive. The children help with simple tasks, but also require entertainment and supervision to prevent them from fighting or making dangerous mistakes. Evening brings the main meal of the day, which is usually the largest portion of food anyone will receive, but still smaller than what they would normally eat. After eating, the family spends time in conversation, storytelling, or simple games that don't require any materials. These activities serve the important purpose of maintaining social bonds and providing distraction from their circumstances. The nights are the most dangerous time, when temperatures drop to their lowest levels, and the fire requires constant attention to prevent it from going out entirely. Family members take turns staying awake to monitor the fire, but these shifts are exhausting and create additional stress for people who are already weakened by poor nutrition and constant anxiety. The sounds of the storm create a constant background of stress and uncertainty. The wind howls around the cottage with varying intensity, sometimes seeming to die down enough to offer hope that the weather is improving, then returning with renewed force that makes the walls shake and the roof timbers groan. Snow and ice hit the shutters with a sound like hail, and the entire structure creaks and settles under the weight of accumulating precipitation. But perhaps more disturbing than the storm sounds are the periods of complete silence that occur when the wind temporarily stops. These quiet moments should be peaceful, but instead they create anxiety about what might be happening outside. Is the storm actually ending? Or is this just a brief pause before conditions get even worse? How much more snow has accumulated? Are the dangers building up that the family can't see or hear? The isolation from the outside world is complete and psychologically devastating. Under normal circumstances, Aldrich's family would have regular contact with neighbours, trips to the village for supplies and social interaction, and a sense of being part of a larger community. Now they exist in a bubble of white silence, where no information comes in and no communication goes out. This isolation creates anxiety about what might be happening to other people in the area. Are the neighbours surviving the storm? Has anyone died? Are there rescue efforts being organised? Or is everyone too busy with their own survival to help others? The lack of information makes it impossible to know whether their situation is typical or whether they're facing unique challenges that might require different strategies. The entertainment options available to the family are extremely limited, but they become crucial for maintaining sanity during the long hours of confinement. Storytelling is the primary form of recreation, with family members taking turns recounting folk tales, personal memories, or imaginary adventures. These stories serve multiple purposes. They pass time, they provide mental stimulation, and they create a sense of shared experience that helps maintain family bonds. The children are particularly hungry for entertainment, and their boredom can quickly turn into destructive behaviour if not managed carefully. Aldrich has carved simple toys from scraps of wood, and Mildred has created games using beans or pebbles. But these activities lose their appeal quickly when repeated constantly, and the challenge of keeping 3 children occupied in such a confined space requires constant creativity and patience. Religious observance takes on increased importance during the crisis, partly because it provides structure and comfort, but also because the family's survival seems to depend on divine intervention as much as human effort. Aldrich leads daily prayers asking for the storm to end, for their supplies to last, and for protection from the dangers that surround them. These prayers provide psychological comfort, but they also highlight the family's powerlessness in the face of natural forces beyond their control. The physical deterioration that occurs during the siege is gradual but noticeable. Everyone loses weight as the reduced food intake takes its toll. The children become listless and irritable, their usual energy dampened by hunger and confinement. Aldrich feels his strength declining as the physical demands of maintaining the fire and caring for the animals become more difficult on reduced nutrition. Mildred develops a persistent cough from breathing smoke-filled air for weeks, and her hands become cracked and infected from the constant exposure to cold and wet conditions. The lack of fresh food creates problems with nutrition that manifest as minor illnesses, slow healing of small injuries, and a general sense of physical weakness that makes every task more difficult. The animals suffer as well, though their survival is crucial for the family's long-term prospects. The goats produce less milk as their food supply dwindles, and their coats become dull and patchy from the stress of confinement. The chickens stop laying eggs regularly, partly from poor nutrition, but also from the disruption of their normal routines. These changes in animal productivity create additional anxiety about food supplies and future survival. The waste management challenges of housing both humans and animals in such a confined space become increasingly serious as the siege continues. Human waste has to be stored in containers until it can be disposed of outside, but the storm makes outside disposal impossible. The smell becomes overwhelming, and the health risks from poor sanitation increase daily. Animal waste accumulates even faster and creates additional problems. Goat droppings and chicken waste pile up, despite regular cleaning efforts, and the resulting smells and unsanitary conditions contribute to the respiratory problems that affect everyone in the family. The confined space makes it impossible to maintain the separation between living areas and waste storage that would be normal under other circumstances. The mental health effects of the prolonged siege begin to manifest in various ways among different family members. Aldrich becomes increasingly obsessed with calculating and recalculating their supplies, checking and rechecking the structural integrity of the cottage, and planning for scenarios that become progressively more dire. His anxiety about their survival makes him irritable and sometimes irrational in his decision-making. Mildred retreats into herself, becoming quiet and withdrawn, as she focuses on the complex task of managing their dwindling resources. She second-guesses every decision about food distribution, constantly worrying that she's making mistakes that could cost her family their lives. The weight of responsibility for keeping everyone fed creates a burden of stress that affects her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to enjoy even the small pleasures that remain available. The children respond to the stress in different ways, depending on their ages and personalities. The youngest, at 6 years old, doesn't fully understand the danger, but is affected by the anxiety of the adults and the discomfort of constant hunger and cold. The middle child, age 9, is old enough to understand that something is seriously wrong, but too young to do anything meaningful to help, creating feelings of helplessness and fear. The oldest, at 12, is beginning to understand the full implications of their situation and is struggling with adult-level anxiety while still being treated as a child. The relationships between family members are tested in ways that peacetime never demands. Small disagreements become major conflicts when there's no escape from the people you're angry with. Acts of kindness and sacrifice become more meaningful when resources are genuinely scarce. The children learn things about their parents, both strengths and weaknesses, that they might never have discovered under normal circumstances. Aldrich and Mildred's marriage faces stresses that would challenge any relationship. They have to make life and death decisions together while dealing with their own fears and physical discomfort. They have to present a united front to the children while privately sharing doubts and anxieties with each other. They have to maintain intimacy and partnership in circumstances that leave no room for privacy or romance. The medical challenges that arise during the siege are particularly frightening because there's no possibility of outside help or expert treatment. When the youngest child develops a fever, Mildred has to treat it with whatever herbal remedies she has available and whatever folk medicine knowledge she's acquired over the years. The fear that a minor illness could become serious without proper treatment adds another layer of anxiety to an already stressful situation. Injuries become more serious concerns when medical help is unavailable. When Aldrich cuts his hand while chopping wood for the fire, the wound becomes infected despite Mildred's efforts to keep it clean. The infection creates additional health risks and reduces Aldrich's ability to perform the physical tasks that are essential for the family's survival. The dreams and nightmares that plague the family during the siege reflect their conscious and unconscious fears about their situation. Aldrich dreams about the roof collapsing about running out of food, about finding his family frozen to death in the morning. Mildred has nightmares about making the wrong decisions, about food rationing, about the children starving while she watches helplessly. The children dream about warmth, about abundance, about escape from the confined space that has become their entire world. But there are also dreams of hope, visions of spring returning, of the snow melting, of returning to normal life, with a deeper appreciation for things they previously took for granted. These positive dreams provide psychological relief and help maintain the hope that's essential for continuing to fight for survival. The gradual changes in weather that eventually signal the end of the siege are noticed first in subtle ways: a slight change in the sound of the wind, a barely perceptible increase in the amount of light filtering through the shutters, a sense that the air pressure is different. These small signs create both hope and anxiety, because they might indicate that conditions are improving, or they might just be temporary variations in a storm that could continue for days longer. As the storm finally begins to weaken, the family faces the challenge of determining when it's safe to venture outside and begin the process of digging out. Leaving the cottage too early could be fatal if the weather worsens again, but waiting too long means continuing to deplete their remaining supplies unnecessarily. The first glimpse of the outside world after 2 weeks of confinement is both shocking and beautiful. The landscape has been transformed into something completely unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks are buried under snow, trees have been broken by the weight of ice, and the world looks like an alien planet rather than the familiar farm that the family has worked for years. The work of digging out from the storm is exhausting for people who are already weakened by weeks of poor nutrition and limited physical activity. Every shovelful of snow represents a victory over the forces that have held them prisoner. But the amount of snow that needs to be moved seems almost impossible for a single family to handle. The damage assessment that follows reveals the true cost of the siege. Outbuildings have collapsed under the weight of snow. Fences have been destroyed by falling trees. The carefully maintained agricultural infrastructure that represents years of work has been damaged or destroyed. The financial and practical implications of this damage will affect the family's survival prospects for months or even years to come. But there are also discoveries of unexpected resilience and survival. Some animals that were left outside have managed to survive by finding shelter and food sources that the family didn't know existed. Some stored supplies that seemed completely inaccessible turn out to be recoverable. Some damage that looked catastrophic from inside the cottage turns out to be repairable with time and effort. The reunion with neighbours who have also survived the siege creates a sense of community and shared experience that helps everyone process the trauma of what they've endured. The stories that are shared about different survival strategies, different challenges, and different outcomes provide valuable information for preparing for future emergencies. But the psychological effects of the siege don't end when the snow melts. Aldrich finds himself constantly worried about weather patterns and obsessively stockpiling supplies far beyond what would normally be considered necessary. Mildred continues to ration food even when scarcity is no longer an issue, unable to shake the anxiety about running out. The children show signs of anxiety about being confined in small spaces and require reassurance that they won't be trapped again. The lessons learned during the siege become part of the family's survival knowledge and are passed down to future generations. The importance of emergency supplies, the techniques for staying warm with limited fuel, the methods for rationing food during shortages, all of these become part of the accumulated wisdom that helps families survive in a world where such emergencies are always possible. As Aldrich stands at his window on the first clear morning after the siege, looking out at a world transformed by snow, but still recognizable as home, He understands that his family has survived something that could easily have killed them. They're thinner, weaker, and more anxious than they were 2 weeks ago. But they're alive. The experience has taught them things about their own resilience, about the importance of community, and about the precarious nature of survival in a world where the weather can turn deadly without warning. The simple act of opening the door and stepping outside feels like a resurrection, a return to life from a kind of temporary death. The cold air that seemed so threatening during the siege now feels fresh and clean. The snow that was their enemy is now just beautiful precipitation that will provide water for crops when it melts. The world that seemed to be trying to kill them has returned to being simply the challenging but manageable environment they've always known. But Aldrich also knows that this won't be the last such siege his family faces, and the knowledge of what it takes to survive will shape every decision he makes about preparing for future winters. The 2 weeks of being snowed in have become a defining experience that will influence how he builds his home, how he stores supplies, how he prepares for emergencies, and how he values the simple freedoms of being able to go outside whenever he chooses.